Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we'll finally be doing the laning full in-depth guide. I know you guys have been waiting a while, so I'm not going to keep you much longer. In this video, we're going to go over kind of like all the concepts that I think you need to know for laning, and also like we'll go through quite a lot of examples. Laning is something that like depends matchup to matchup and also player to player. Like playing the same matchup against a different player could be very different, but I think if you learn like the strong like fundamentals of laning and how to apply them, you'll basically just be able to pick up like any matchup against any player in like a really short amount of time. As you guys know, I like to kind of show you guys my credentials so you know what I'm talking about and so I can flex a little bit. But in LCO Split 2 2021, which is the most recent split of competitive I played, I averaged a 20 CSD at 15 minutes, ahead in CS at 15 minutes 81% of the time. So basically all I'm trying to say is the techniques, the laning techniques that I've perfected have worked even to a pro level, at least within my region. So hopefully you guys will be able to apply it in your solo queue games as well. Okay guys, so I'm going to start off by like defining some concepts for you guys that'll be useful. Don't worry about the footage, it's just like some back footage for you guys. But first we're going to talk about the concept of like a temporary advantage and a permanent advantage. So temporary advantages are stuff that they don't impact the game beyond like the current moment. So stuff like an HP advantage or a cooldown advantage, stuff like this. They don't like translate into more than like what they are right now. And a permanent advantage would be something like gold. So to give you an example, if you get your opponent to 1 HP, right? And then you both base, but you have the same HP, the same everything basically, that temporary advantage you had of the health lead, like your opponent's on 1 HP, it didn't actually convert into anything. So something we're going to talk about a lot is how we turn these like temporary advantages, like a level advantage, a cooldown advantage, a health advantage, like position advantage, all these things into more permanent advantages like XP and gold, which are the two main ones that we're going to talk about. In theory, these are temporary because like in theory, someone can catch up in gold, right? But I more mean like if you deny someone a CS, there is no way they can ever get that CS again. They can get more CS later in the game, but that CS that you denied is now a permanent kind of like they have missed that goal forever. So with that in mind, we can kind of break down the laning phase into like 3 different parts. So we have the like initial building of advantage, so building or like how to create your temporary advantages in the first place. That's the first stage. We have the second stage of converting these temporary advantages into permanent advantages like gold and CS. And finally, we have the last stage of extending these permanent leads with these permanent advantages into even bigger permanent advantages. So we're going to go over each of these, kind of how to do them and what skills kind of like are necessary for it. And hopefully that'll give you everything you need to know. So the first kind of laning fundamental that's going to be very important for creating these temporary advantages, and probably the most significant one, is your wave control. So wave control can be used for a lot of things, but if done correctly, it can give you positional advantage, it can give you minion and level advantage. So let's go over kind of like what your basic opener is with your waves. This is what I like to call a 3-wave bounce or a 3-wave crash. Basically, it means you're going to be pushing the first 3 waves in and stacking them up so that the minions kind of like slow push into the tower. And this does like quite a few things for you. So the first thing is it gives you a minion advantage. So you'll see as this like wave starts to build and push in that I'll have more minions on my side than Katarina does. And so that gives you a slight advantage because if you ever trade auto attacks, like if you both hit each other, you have more minions hitting him that he has hitting you. So that's a very slight advantage that can give you. A second advantage this can give you is that you will hit level 2, and if you do it properly and you crash 3 waves, you actually hit level 3 first as well. So you won't always be able to punish with this, but a lot of the time that like level 2 versus level 1 advantage, or that level 3 versus level 2 advantage, you'll be able to get some really nice trades with that. Another thing that the 3-wave like can kind of do for you is it allows you to kind of harass your opponent when they go for creeps. They're most likely going to be on the defensive, like they're on their side, especially when they go under tower. That gives you another opportunity to really harass them. So basically, if you are in a winning matchup, starting the lane off with like this 3-wave bounce, this 3-wave crash gives you like a lot of temporary advantages that you can use to convert into more permanent advantages. Another thing is that when you crash 3 waves like this, it does give you a lot of time to go and do stuff. You can ward, you can invade the jungles, so again more temporary advantages like granted by the priority of mid lane that you've just generated. You can see here, just coming back to harass the Katarina, it's very difficult for her to get the CS like on the tower here without taking like a lot of damage for it. And Katarina does like want to try and stay healthy here. I think she probably could have queued those creeps. Maybe she was like AFK for a second there. Actually not sure. And here's another thing is when you crash 3 waves, the wave will eventually push back to you like this. And so if you have created some advantages already, you can choose to freeze this wave here, but we're going to talk about that later in the video. So just know that a 3 wave is a really good way to kind of start your lane, and it creates a lot of these temporary advantages for you. So another variation we have on this is actually the 2 wave crash. So there are some games where it might be too greedy to crash 3 waves. So the reason is that if you're versus, like, say, a strong ganking jungler, or the enemy mid has like really strong gank setup, it can be quite scary to have the wave like pushed up that far. So this game, I'm playing Lucian, I'm very gankable, and LeBlanc has like very strong gank setup. They also have Lee Sin, and I have Kayn, so they have a ganking jungler, whereas I have a farming jungler, which means even though I do have advantage in this lane, I kind of need to crash 2 waves and then back off, otherwise I need to be quite scared of a gank. But if I look to crash 2 waves, I still get this like level 2 versus level 1 advantage, which you can see I converted into an HP advantage, which I can then convert later into a bigger CS advantage. So yeah, here I just like basically pushed the wave faster than before. You can go back and look at the VODs specifically to see how like you crashed the wave at the right time, but basically with the 3 wave, you just need like, I think like a 1 creep advantage on average, and the 2 wave, you just need to push a bit faster than that. So at this point, you have a couple of choices. If you want, after getting that ward, you can continue to push, or you can let the wave come to you. It sort of depends on your matchup. Again, more things we're going to go into. That's how you execute the 2 wave bounce or the 2 wave crash. And that's going to be very useful when you're still in these winning lanes, but you're a bit scared to have the wave pushed up at like the 3-minute mark. Another wave control technique that can be very, very useful is freezing. So freezing is very risk versus reward, and you do have to like be pretty careful with how you do it. So basically, when you freeze the wave, you'll make sure the enemy, like, it's easy to do after the wave crashes and bounces back to you, and you want to make it so the enemy has more creeps than you, and that they have to push up for this. So there's a lot of things that freezing can do for you. It can help you deny a lot of creeps. It can allow you to take trades if they use spells to like clear these creeps. You can look to punish their cooldown. It makes you safe from ganks, and it makes them vulnerable to ganks. But it does come at some cost as well. So the first thing is that you can't really roam anywhere, and also it can give the enemy like the chance to roam somewhere. So basically my kind of like rule, I guess, or like the way I think about like when I should freeze is when I can like build a significant advantage from it and my opponent doesn't really have anywhere to go. So like a level 4 LeBlanc can't really roam anywhere meaningful, especially not when like my other lanes are kind of in somewhat safe positions. And because I'm level 5 or level 4, I can significantly deny her. If she ever comes up to use spells on the wave, I can punish her very heavily for it. And also it makes me safe to this like LeBlanc Lee Sin gank. So there's like a lot of good reasons to freeze here, but there's some times where you just like don't want to freeze. Like for example, if they have a really heavy roaming champ like Talon, for example, you would basically never want to freeze the wave in this position because Talon's just going to run around the map and kill everyone. And even that like sort of has some exceptions, right? Like if you take it to a really high level and you look at kind of your mini-map, you guys can see this, yeah, okay. So if you look at your mini-map and you saw like all your lanes were on high HP and they were in really safe positions, then you could probably still freeze the wave. But I guess what I'm trying to say, guys, is like freezing is very, very valuable when you get it right, but if you do it at the wrong time, it's something that can actively hurt your team. So I guess like the best way kind of for you guys to learn is either you can like watch VODs of people just playing out lanes and see when they freeze, or alternatively, you can just like try it in games, and when it doesn't happen, you can go back and watch the replay and kind of see. But with the wave kept here, it's very difficult for LeBlanc to do anything, and you can see she's just like constantly losing creeps in this situation. So it's very nice to freeze here. I can just poke her and I can just like keep the wave stuck in this position where she has no all-in threat onto me, they have no gank threat onto me, and I can just like continue to deny creeps like this. So you can see every time she goes up for these creeps, she's getting punished for it, and the wave continues to be in a spot that makes it very, very difficult to farm. This is one of the VODs that we're going to be going over in depth at the end of the video, so if you don't understand it by this point, don't worry about it, but just know that like freezing, it has like some really insane benefits to it if you do it at the right time. Now there are some times where you actually might want to keep the wave like just in the middle, so you actually don't want to push and you don't want to pull it either. So this is an example of that. So in this matchup, Orianna versus Syndra, it's very easy to harass each other like when you're in the middle of the lane. But the main reason I don't kind of like want to freeze the wave and punish the Syndra is because that'll allow Nidalee to invade my Hecarim. And because these are both like farming champs, and without the mid prior, like Hecarim's likely to get kind of like punished by the Nidalee. It's really important that I don't give up the mid prior. On the other hand, I don't really want to like push too far into his tower because I know that Nidalee has just like done the Herald, I think, so it could be scary for me to push up to tower against like a strong ganking champ like Syndra. So in those kind of situations, you can just like keep the wave in the middle. So you see I'm not really pushing it here. I'm instead just looking to harass my opponent when they go for CS. Another reason this can be good is if some champions, you won't be able to all in the enemy under tower. You won't be able to poke them on tower because you lack the range. So a champion like Cassio really likes the wave in the middle or on her side because like she wants room to run them down. Whereas like if they're up against their tower, it can be quite difficult. So there, yeah, just like keep in mind that there are also some times where the wave in the middle, like not pushing to either side, is actually the best decision. Your wave control will also depend on what kind of matchup you're playing. So while obviously a lot of matchups are unique, a lot of them also do play out somewhat similar. So I guess kind of the main sort of like categories or overviews that we have are we have the ranged versus ranged, we have the ranged versus melee, melee versus ranged, and finally the melee versus melee. So I'm going to quickly talk about how your wave control might differ in these kind of matchups. So if you're in a typically, if you're a ranged champion, you're very good at poking. You kind of like want to keep range, poke your opponent down and not get all in. So if you're against another ranged champion, so you're playing a range versus ranged matchup, so say you're like Syndra versus Orianna, or basically any kind of like mage versus mage, you know, AD carry versus AD carry, any ranged champ really, pushing the wave will generally be better. And that's because if you freeze the wave, generally ranged champs do have an easier time farming, although it's not always the case. But some of them do like farm pretty well from range. And also in the early game, you can get a lot of poke when they're under tower. That level 2 advantage and stuff can be really, really good. So if you want kind of like an all-rounder, range versus range, like 3-wave crash or 2-wave crash will probably be the best. Now, if you're melee versus range, typically you have very good all-in, but you're very weak in the early game, or at least for the first couple levels. So if you're a melee champion, normally you want to let the first like 2 or 3 waves come to you, and that's so that you can farm kind of like safely on your side. You don't want to be too pushed up in the lane, and this also has the benefit of making the enemy gankable. Most of the melee champions do have good gank setup, and yeah, just like makes you safe, kind of like when you're weak, you know, you can't really get punished too hard for it, and allows you to take those extended trades, which generally like mages and champs aren't too happy with. Another one people struggle with is playing range versus melee. So if you're on the range side of things, well actually both sides, so if you're on the melee side, you really want lots of room to all in, right? And in the early game, you need to be quite careful. So if you're on the other side of this, if you're on the range side of this, you kind of want the same things. In the first couple levels, you want to try to do as much damage as possible, but after that, melee champions have a very difficult time farming from range. So the range champion also kind of wants to freeze the wave on their side, and that can make it very hard for the melee champion to all in and to farm. So in those range versus range matchups where pushing is kind of key, in the melee versus range and range versus melee, both sides kind of want the wave like more on their side. It makes the game quite hard to play for the enemy mid. Now, when you're in a melee versus melee matchup, these are probably the ones that are the hardest to define because the melees are so different, and they have like so many different, you know, they have like unique interactions and stuff, and it'll depend a lot on what kind of melee champ you are. For example, there are melee champs that just kind of destroy other melee champs, so like Fiora, for example. On the other hand, there are melee champs that rely just on their push to kind of survive, so champs like Galio. So in those matchups, it's much more matchup dependent, but I'd say if you're in a melee versus melee matchup and you're winning, if you can get the push, it'll probably be better to give you that level 2 and level 3 advantage. But if you can't, you'll probably just have to play it much like a melee versus ranged, where you let the wave come to you. So hopefully that's kind of a good overview of wave control. Again, we're going to go through plenty of examples, so don't worry about that. But just to summarize, there are lots of useful things you can do with your wave control. So like your openers, like your 3-wave, your 2-wave, freezing versus pushing, like keeping the wave in the middle, they all have a lot of different pros and cons to them, and they can be used in different matchups, different states of the game. But again, if you want that like general overview, if you're in a range versus range, I really recommend like pushing most of the time. If you're in melee versus range or range versus melee, generally pulling the wave or freezing is going to be like better a lot of the time. And finally, if you're in your melee versus melee, you're probably going to need to watch matchups like specifically, but if you are winning, like if you are ahead or if you're stronger, you can push, and if you're not, you probably need to kind of like pull the wave to your side. One thing I'll also bring up that I actually forgot is there are certain matchups which kind of evolve. So for example, Corki pre-6 can't really trade with anything and is very vulnerable to getting frozen on, even though he's a range champ, because his abilities cost so much mana. Like if he has to ever W away from a gank, it's extremely expensive. Farming with Q is extremely expensive. So against like champs like Corki, that are very weak in the early game, they can, you can like really bully them in that kind of stage. But then after level 6, Corki somewhat evolves into being able to farm from range from very cheap because he unlocks his rockets. So in that sort of matchup, it's not going to be, in most of these like matchups actually, there are going to be different stages to it. So you will not always play against the champion with the same wave control the whole time. So let me give some more examples. So a champion like Akali in the pre-6 can be bullied quite a lot, and you actually can be quite aggressive. You can push the lane a lot if you want to, but post-6 against Akali, you would really need a wave on your side because otherwise you can be easily all in. Another kind of matchup that might not go like the way it normally does is, say, a champion like Aurelia. So if you did a 3-wave crash against Aurelia, it'd be very risky because unlike most melee champions that spike at level 3, Aurelia spikes hard at level 2. So in that case, you would need a 2-wave crash because if your wave ends up frozen outside Aurelia's tower at level 3, well, you're probably going to die. And another thing is that Aurelia's matchup, or actually a lot of the matchups, can change rather than just by hitting a level breakpoint, but actually by an item breakpoint. So again, a champ like Aurelia, when they get like Vamp Scepter, they become pretty much immune to poke. Like they basically just sustain it all up. So at that point, like poking them under tower and kind of like poking them on every CS might not even be worth it anymore. So there are a lot of those matchups that will change. We'll talk a bit more about what matchups mean and like kind of everything around that, but hopefully that gives you some kind of insight, at least as to how wave control might change based on the matchup. So next we're going to talk about your laning positioning and kind of your laning movement. We're not going to talk too in depth about how to avoid the jungler and stuff like that. We're mainly just going to be talking about how to position in the 1v1. We'll have a future jungler video later, but don't worry about it too much at the moment. So yeah, let's get started. So laning positioning and laning movement can be like very, very useful. It can do a lot of things for you. For example, you can use your positioning to deny CS. You can use your positioning to bait out skill shots. You can use your positioning obviously to dodge skill shots or your movement and stuff like that. So let's have a look at this. We're playing Orianna vs Syndra. If you've watched my Orianna guide, you would have seen this whole VOD already. And if you haven't, could be another one that you want to watch. Just like skip to the laning section of my Orianna guide. So you'll see a lot. The first off is probably the movement. So you'll see a lot if you just like pay attention to my cursor that I'm clicking a lot, and that allows me to dodge like not all but a lot of Syndra's skill shots. And if people use skill shots at the wrong time, it'll waste a lot of their mana. Another thing that you can quickly see here is that I'm using my kind of positioning to deny CS. So after he uses cooldown, okay, I'm going to talk about cooldowns in a bit. I know that he wants to CS these creeps, but his Q's on cooldown, so I move quite aggressively into him, and he's kind of forced to trade back on me and actually misses one of those creeps. That's very nice, and all this time I'm kind of just like clicking around a lot and looking to dodge a lot of skill shots. So with your kind of movement, you want to be like looking to dodge a lot of skill shots, and you also want to be looking to play aggressive when they go to CS. So kind of the ways I would think about this is if you're the aggressor in the matchup, like if you're winning, or if you have some temporary advantage, like a cooldown advantage or something like that, you want to try like be like in a triangle or in line with the CS they want to get. So if we know he wants to get this CS, we can either make a straight line, so you want to position somewhere like here, or you can think about it as making a triangle between like where you and the creep are. This basically means that if they go to get this CS, that they will take harass from it. Essentially, they have to choose between hitting you or hitting the CS. Another thing you can do, which is what I'm doing here, is you can click forward aggressively to bait out skill shots, even if they don't really like need to use them. Like in theory, Syndra doesn't need to use either of her skills there, but because I'm moving quite aggressively, she feels the need to punish me, and that's kind of like a higher level thing. But it's something you should definitely be aware of, especially in the skill shot heavy matchups. Like your movement makes a big difference. And another thing is that you can, like, if you just think about it. So when we were talking before about how you want to use that line and kind of create the circle, you can kind of see how much like pressure your positioning has. So for example, if your opponent wants to CS this creep and you're standing all the way back here, your positioning has no threat. Even if you stand here and don't use any spell, it's just inherently more threatening because the enemy has to think about it when they're going for the creep. So even if you don't use your spells, your positioning itself like conveys some threat and can bait out skill shots. So for example, again, if you're standing aggressively, like positioning in line with the creep that the enemy wants to CS, they have to think about you. They might try and hit you with a skill shot, and you need to be ready to move away from that. So yeah, I think kind of hard to describe this section honestly, but I think probably the best advice I can give is try and create pressure with your positioning. Try and like move into your opponent, try and actively bait out skill shots and then click back out of them. And that can create you a lot of advantages in the laning phase, and something that I think pro mid laners in particular are much better at than solo queue players. And it's a big reason why a lot of these mid matchups are very winnable for pro players, even if they're kind of disadvantageous, because a lot of them are skill shot based. And simply put, like if you're really good, you can dodge a lot of the skill shot. Because I probably will get some questions about it, even though I'm going to go over in another video, I'll quickly say like kind of how you should be positioning in the lane to like avoid ganks. So generally you want to hug towards the side with vision. So in this example, like I have a pink ward and I have a Hecarim on my bot side, so I know that if I position on the bottom side of the lane that I'll likely be kind of safe from any ganks. I kind of wanted to bring that up just because I feel like if a lot of you are starting to play more aggressive as a result of this laning guide, it is more likely that you die. So you want to try, especially if you're passing the halfway point, you want to try and make sure you have a ward somewhere, and you kind of want to hug to that side of vision. So like if you ward bot side, you kind of want to be positioning bot side, and you kind of need to make sure your ward's in a place that it actually sees stuff. Like sometimes, well, like for example, if you're against a long-range ganking champ like Hecarim, a ward that's just in your side bush isn't going to help, but against some champs it will. So yeah, again, that's going to be a completely different video, but I thought I'd just let you guys know, if you do want to be safe from the jungler, hug to your side with vision, and generally you'll be safe. So now we're going to talk about cooldown punishment. So cooldown punishment is a really big part of mid lane. It's relevant in basically every matchup. And what this basically means is when your opponent uses a cooldown, you know, whether it's a Q, W, E, or R, that you find a way to punish it. And you kind of do need to think about this because when someone uses a cooldown, doesn't necessarily mean it's punishable. So let me give you some examples. If we take the LeBlanc versus Syndra matchup, the Syndra E I think has around an 18-second cooldown, which is about the same, maybe it's 16 second, and LeBlanc W is about 18, if I remember correctly. And what that means is basically if Syndra wastes E, it's a really good time for LeBlanc to like dash in and get a good trade, because Syndra won't be able to block LeBlanc's dash. So in that matchup, in the LeBlanc versus Syndra matchup, the E is like very important. On the other hand, in the same matchup, something like Syndra's W isn't really a punishable cooldown. It doesn't really matter. Like, even if Syndra's W is like, I think a 13-second cooldown, if she uses it, it doesn't really matter because she can still QE, she can still harass you with Q if you try and make a trade on her. So essentially, in this matchup, Syndra's W is sort of like a dead spell. So what I like to kind of think about is, when I go into a matchup, I try and like know just like roughly in the ballpark like what kind of cooldown the enemy abilities have, and then think about which ones are actually useful, like both like to their champion and to the matchup. So there are a few different ways to punish cooldowns, and the first one is with trading. So we're just going to show this here. Basically, I'm playing Lucian versus Victor, and so in this matchup, Victor has like two really important spells against Lucian. So that's his Q and his W. So his W is important because it can like root Lucian in place, and he can disengage from the trade. And his Q is really important because it's a very strong trading tool. But his E honestly doesn't really matter because he should never be getting Victor low. Sorry, should never be getting Lucian low. So it's just a bit more damage added to the trade, but it doesn't like functionally change the outcome of the trade. So here, when I'm laning, I'm waiting for him to use a cooldown. As soon as he uses his Q, I look to play aggressive on him. Now that I know that one of the two important cooldowns is gone, I can look to play very aggressively into him. So this is probably the most aggressive form of cooldown punishing, is you can just like look for trades, like heavy trades or all-ins, whenever someone uses a cooldown like that. So here I'll show you guys another example of that kind of like heavy trade punish. So here I'm TPing into lane and Victor trades his W with my E. Now this is about the same cooldown, except I can lower the cooldown of my E. So what that means basically is that if I put a bunch of orders on these waves, I'll actually be able to dash into him. So here he's used his Q and we know his E's on cooldown. Oh, sorry. He's used his Q and we know his W's on cooldown, and I'm able to E forward into him and get another really heavy trade. And this is, again, something we're going to go over later on, but when you have like this big an advantage, you can easily zone them off the creep wave, but I'm coming back to this example later, so I'm not going to go too in depth into it right now. So the second kind of like more common, and I'd say the one like you're going to use way more, is just like punishing cooldowns with like CS. So when if you can't heavy trade, like if you can't just like walk into them, or you're playing a poke champion, like you can't really just like chase someone down the lane, When someone uses a cooldown, you kind of want to use that as a trigger to see if you can deny them a CS with your positioning. So we've already talked about how your positioning can threaten people off CS. So one thing people will do is if you stand next to a CS, like if you stand here, oftentimes they'll use a spell just to clear the CS. And that's still good because it means they're not using spells on you, and it means they're using mana, but it's better if they're on cooldown, you're standing here, and then they can't get the CS without taking damage for it. So we'll see here, Syndra Q is harder to punish than normal spells because it's only got a 4-second cooldown, but Syndra uses Q here and also uses E and W. So there's these two creeps here, and there's also a creep here. Again, another Q used, which means we can walk forward and try, you see this positioning, threaten Syndra off. If Syndra wants to get the CS, she has to auto it, which means she gets QW'd. So again, I'm punishing the cooldown, this time not with a heavy trade, but just by walking at her. Nice dodge. So she actually, this is interesting. So I looked to harass her when she went for the CS, and she dodged it, but she has to give up that CS as a result. Again, she does get this one, but she's used another cooldown, which is why I'm going to walk forward here and not let her get this one back here. So this is like more common, I'd say, like, unless, I don't know, it depends on your champion. Like some matchups you will heavy trade to punish, and especially if you're like playing a melee champ. On the other case, or in the other hand, a lot of champs will just be looking to poke and kind of like whittle away at their opponent and deny CS like a little bit at a time. So I think those are the like main two ways to punish cooldowns. And there will be like plenty of examples of this at the end, so I'm not going to do too many examples now. I just want you to kind of like be aware that punishing punishing cooldowns is a very, very good way to like gain a health advantage that can later be translated into a gold advantage. So very similar to kind of like cooldown punishing, it's also a really good time to punish people when they go for CS. So if someone has no cooldown, you can basically trade on them whenever, but if someone does have cooldowns, it's like best to look to poke them when they go for a CS. But also, even if they don't have cooldowns, like sometimes they will greed and walk up for a creep anyway, especially at lower levels. So here in this Lucian versus LeBlanc matchup, you're going to see that pretty much every time I use my Q is when LeBlanc's kind of like going for CS, and that makes hitting the spells a lot easier. So it's something I've probably like talked about a lot already, but when you're in especially high level play, a lot of these like skill shots will get dodged. Things like, you know, Syndra Q will get dodged quite a lot. Lucian Q being a line skill shot by high level players gets dodged quite a bit. There's like a few good things, like really good things about trading when someone goes for CS. Obviously, like they have to choose between hitting you or hitting the creep. It also normally locks them in place if they are going for the creep. And another reason is that a lot of the time, like just playing aggressive, we'll just like deny them creeps even without having to actually like commit onto them. You can see here, like still just looking for poke. Whenever he goes for a creep basically, and that's allowing me to hit a lot of those like just like Lucian Q skill shots. Yeah, and so basically all I'm really doing is I'm on every CS, I'm trying to stay near it, and if I have a way to punish, whether it's like with a heavy trade if he wastes a cooldown, or if I just poke him, it's just like a really convenient time. You can see there, like he was looking for that creep, and I used my positioning to just walk up and deny it because he was scared of taking an extended trade. So I think CD punishment and CS punishment or harassment kind of go hand in hand. They're very similar. It's just kind of like the best timing in which to play aggressive when your opponent is kind of like locked in an action and when their movement is going to be somewhat predictable. So yeah, I guess this is another thing where like I've already talked about it quite a bit before. I just want you to like keep in mind and look out for it when we're going over the VODs, when we're going over the examples kind of at the end of the video. And the next kind of like broad concept that I want to talk about, and I'm actually going to spend a while on this one, is like matchups. So one thing when I was like new to Challenger, people would say like, oh, you just like need to know your matchups, and they'd say stuff like that. But I feel like when people say that, they never say like what you actually need to know. And I actually remember this like confusing me for a really long time. He was saying, you know, you just got to know your matchup level 1 to 18. You just got to know how to play your matchups. You just hear these like buzzwords over and over, and without people actually saying what things you need to know. So I'm gonna like tell you guys here like what things like sort of make champions win or lose matchups. And kind of like what things specifically you need to know or need to think about when you come into a matchup. So probably the first one is the concept of like extended trades and short trades. So in a lot of matchups, you will have champions that kind of excel at extended trades. So typically these will be like DPS champs or like melee champs just things that where like if they the longer the trade goes, the more they win. So like a champion like Cassiopeia, Aurelia, you know, Yone, Yasuo, like typically these champions win longer trades because they have like lots of sustain damage and they can keep trading. And on the other hand, we have champs that like trade with burst. So we have like Syndra or LeBlanc or champions that want these really short trades, and typically the longer the trade goes, will probably lose to these champions that have extended trades. So the first thing you kind of need to like recognize in a matchup is who wins extended trades and who wins short trades. And it might be that if you've counterpicked your opponent that you actually win short trades and burst trades, like, you know, depending on the matchup. So if we use this matchup as an example, both of these champions are typically champions that want extended trades, but Cassiopeia is actually better at extended trades than Yone, and that means basically that Yone doesn't really have that much of a win con in this matchup. His only real, I guess, like win con is short burst trades where like he can get like a Q3 knockup and like just do a short little trade on Cassio and then get out before Cassio starts DPSing. So this is an example of a matchup where I would say Cassio is like extremely favored because she has picked into a champion that takes extended trades and wins extended trades even harder, essentially. So if you see here, basically, as long as the trade keeps going, Cassio does not run out of DPS, basically. So it's not really going to matter like what HP the opponent is on in those kind of matchups where you have your when you're very good at extended trades. Having the wave like more on your side is typically better because it allows you to like run them down all the lane. It gives you like a lot of space to work with. Essentially, your trades are more about time than about like cooldowns or damage or anything like that. So then we might have the opposite here where we have Vex, which is like a burst champion. She wants very short trades versus Yone, which is a champ that wants extended trades. So in this sort of matchup, we just want to like make trades as short as possible, and ideally we don't want to give Yone a long distance to kind of run down. It's not too bad here because it's still in the early game and he doesn't have like the insane trade power, but essentially if you can get any short trades here, it'll be very good. And the only way that Yone can ever win trades is if he just like can constantly auto attack you down. But you see here I retreat into my minions, which makes the trade very, very short, which is extremely favorable for Vex in this matchup. So one like, again, to reiterate, one like really big thing that you need to think about in these matchups: who wins extended trades, who wins short trades, and try and like plan around that. And it might be that you lose both, or it might be that you win both, and sometimes it'll be like you know, you win one and lose one. So you kind of need to structure the way you take trades around that. Another thing that I think is quite important to consider in these matchups is who like even trades favor. So in a matchup like LeBlanc versus TF, if TF can trade evenly, it's actually not super good for him, just because the lower HP that TF gets, like the easier it is for LeBlanc to like all in. And it's not very easy for TF, on the other hand, to all in LeBlanc. So if you think about it, if both champs trade to say like 50% health, you know, who's likely to kill the other? Like really, it's LeBlanc that has the higher chance to kill than the TF. So for TF, if he wanted to take trades in this matchup, that'd actually have to be like quite advantageous for it to be worth it, unless he had like a huge sustain advantage or something. So in a lot of these matchups, just trading evenly, even if the HP is actually even, it might not be the actual, you know, best for the matchup. So particularly if you're against you know, assassin or all-in champs like Kiana, Zed, Talon, LeBlanc, basically anything like this, often the lower HP that you get can actually be bad for you. So that's something else that you need to consider in the matchup, is basically like who is more favored when HP gets lower, even if it's even, and are like even trades actually good for you. So another thing you really need to consider when it comes to these matchups is gank setup. So in a lot of matchups, even if you win the 1v1, even if you win like short trades and extended trades, you might have to play a lot safer just because of like how much gank setup the enemy mid laner has, or what kind of jungler they have, etc. So in this kind of matchup, I'd say normally Victor wins this matchup 1v1, and actually a lot of LeBlanc's matchups, she's either just even or maybe slightly even disadvantageous in the 1v1. But it doesn't really matter because LeBlanc has such good gank setup that a lot of these kind of mages that counter her in the 1v1 are just so vulnerable to getting ganked. So in this sort of matchup as LeBlanc, where trades can be quite difficult, keeping the wave in the middle or on your side against like particularly mobile champions can be very, very valuable, because especially if they don't have flash, like I know Victor doesn't have here, it's basically a free kill if your jungler can come. And so like there are some matchups where even if you have like a really winning matchup, if they've got like a jungler that's like extremely good against your champion, like if you're playing in a mobile mage against something like Zac, it can be really difficult for you to pressure the lane. That's something you kind of need to keep in mind as well, that it's not just your 1v1 that factors into it, but also the jungle, and to maybe a lesser extent, depending on the champion, the support as well. Another thing that's super important is item and level spikes. So there are some matchups where the matchup will drastically change when a kind of champion hits either an item breakpoint or a level breakpoint. So some examples of this are typically when like assassins or burst champions get their first base and they get their like Hextech revolver, suddenly they're able to like 100-0 you or kill you from like 80% health when they weren't able to before. And there's like, this happens in every matchup. You know, there's when mages hit lost chapters, sometimes now they can get through your sustain. There's champions like Aurelia, which when they get Vamp Scepter, suddenly you can't really poke them anymore because they just like have infinite sustain. So part of knowing the matchup is knowing like what items to buy and what item spikes are important, as well as the level spikes. So again, we have champs like Akali, which when they hit level 6, they're a very different champion from when they're level 5. And this again changes like champion to champion. Aurelia is very threatening at level 2, Fizz very threatening at level 3. Some champions might reach a wave clear breakpoint at level 5 or level 7. So a good thing to think about in matchups in general are those item and level power spikes, because oftentimes if you don't respect when it happens, you can be like punished extremely hard, and it can change what was like a winning matchup or an even matchup into one that's now like extremely hard losing, essentially. And oftentimes when you kind of like make the mistake, like you fight your opponent kind of at their spike, it can be very hard to recover from because they get accelerated more and more. The last major kind of element of matchups, and something we've talked about already, is cooldowns. So cooldown length is really important, and kind of in general the champion with shorter cooldowns tend to beat the champions with longer cooldowns. And the reason is that, as we've talked about before, when you're on cooldown, when you're waiting for a spell to come back up, that's a window when you can be punished, and these shorter cooldown champions, they're going to have their skills up during that window when you don't. So in a matchup like LeBlanc versus Syndra, it's slightly Syndra favorite, I would say. There are some other elements that go into it, but one major kind of part of the matchup is that LeBlanc's W has like an 18-second cooldown, and Syndra's Q only has like a 4-second cooldown. So that means that when LeBlanc's W is on cooldown, Syndra has like many windows to punish the LeBlanc, and we'll kind of see that a little bit in this clip here. So you'll see that just when I'm laning, LeBlanc's on this really long cooldown here, which means I have this like huge amount of time where I can just play as aggressive as I want, and there's basically nothing that LeBlanc can do kind of to counter that. So yeah, this is kind of just like reiterating like how important that cooldown thing is. But if you just like have no idea who wins the matchup, a good kind of like starting point is to look at the cooldowns of the champions and kind of see, like which cooldowns are important, and like are there ways for one champion to punish the other champion kind of like during that window when the cooldown is down. So to kind of summarize what I think like knowing a matchup is, I think it's like knowing what to do with your wave, knowing what items to buy, knowing like what levels and like items people spike at, punishing cooldowns, and if there are any like special interactions. So for example, like Yone's E can be like activated to cancel Zoe's bubble, or like Syndra's stun can be used to cancel LeBlanc's W, stuff like that. Just those little special interactions that might impact the matchup, but otherwise it's just that kind of like those standard fundamentals that I think mainly define the matchup. So we've talked a lot about building those temporary advantages and converting them into permanent advantages, but now we're going to talk about extending the advantage. So when you already have an advantage, how you can extend it further. The first way that we can do that is with kind of like a wave control. So there's like a couple ways you can do it, but one of the best ways to extend your advantage further is if you can find a way to dive your opponent. So you do kind of like need to have your jungler for this, so like it's not something you're gonna be able to do every game because it's not entirely up to you, but if you can ever build a wave and stack it and kind of like ping your jungler to come, it can be very nice to like deny a lot of creeps from your opponent like that, and put them really far behind. Another way that you can do this, if I just skip ahead quite a bit, is as we've been talking about before with freezing, if you can ever pull the wave in a state where like they can't really farm it, particularly against like melee champions, you can like kind of like keep a freeze even in mid lane if you're against a melee champion, at least for a pretty long time. And if you are already ahead in a matchup to the point where your opponent can't break the freeze without their jungler, you can kind of just sit here forever. And you know, eventually like they will kind of like have to come up, and it's going to be really easy to kill them sort of like that. Here's another example of that, which I've already shown before, but just so you guys do know it's possible in mid lane. Yeah, if you've already got that lead, it's very, very nice to freeze, to extend that lead even more, because a lot of the time you'll already be strong enough that your opponent can't really afford to take trades with you, and so you can just like threaten them whenever they come up for this wave, and they're kind of forced to get their jungler to help them. Otherwise, they're just going to fall further and further behind. So another way you can extend your lead when you do have an advantage, whether that's like just your champion power, a level advantage, item advantage, basically any advantage that is kind of like big enough to where you can just fight, you can position really, really aggressively. You can either just like walk your opponent off their minions, or you can just like heavy trade with them in the minion wave. There are a lot of times where you can just trade on your opponent and there's like literally nothing they can do to fight back. So this is an example here. I'm playing Zoe versus Ziggs. And I have 2 ignites right now, and he started mana crystal, and he's also very low mana. So even though he's like full HP at this point, I recognize in the moment that if I just fight with him, if I just like walk him off this creep wave, there actually isn't really anything he can do. So this is like one of those times where I'm really extending my advantage, even though actually in this case it's only a temporary advantage because my ignite isn't going to last forever. I just realized that I'm so powerful kind of like at this time that I don't have to let him have access to the creep wave at all. I can literally just fight him on the other side of it. Here's another example of that. So after getting a solo kill, I'm up quite a lot of gold, and I think also I'm up a fair amount of XP. So in this kind of case, I know that Malzahar actually just can't trade with me anymore, which means I can basically just, especially whenever he uses a spell like that, I can just like walk up to him and I don't have to let him have access to the wave at all. I can literally just fight him kind of on the other side of the minion wave. And make it so he can't actually walk up and get any of the CS. He just has to wait for the wave to come all the way to him. So the last and best way to extend your lead is just to kill your opponent. So if you ever can like recognize like they've wasted a key ability and you can all in them, or if they've reached a certain amount of HP and you can kind of kill them like 50-0 or 80-0 or something like that, that's super important to recognize, because there's no better way to extend your lead than by killing your opponent. You obviously get the gold from and XP from killing them, but you also deny them a huge amount of gold and XP from the minion waves they miss. So you need to be, if you're looking, especially when you have an advantage, you really need to be looking for that window to like all in your opponent, or at least like push them out of the lane to where they can't farm. But oftentimes there'll be like a key cooldown that they waste, or like if they take too much damage, you'll see the window to where you can just all in them, and that puts you so far ahead in the lane, and it kind of like, it'll make doing everything else after that even easier. Now we're going to go into some examples so you guys can see how this is actually put into place, and we're going to go over the types of matchups, so melee versus ranged, melee versus melee, and range versus range, and we'll do both sides of the melee range matchup. So yeah, hopefully you guys can see kind of like how we put this stuff actually into practice. Okay, so let's get started with our examples. The first one, range versus range, the Lucian versus LeBlanc matchup. I will quickly say that I have done a lot of range versus range kind of like analysis already, so if you want to check out more on this, I've got like all the kind of like lane-like videos that I've done, and also in each of my champion guides I have a laning section, so I'd recommend checking those out if you kind of like want more kind of like specifics, I guess, or like more specific matchups. But let's have a look at this one. So in the Lucian versus LeBlanc matchup, Lucian is a lot stronger than LeBlanc in both extended and burst trades. The only way LeBlanc can ever really win a trade is if she punishes one of Lucian's cooldowns, but Lucian actually has shorter cooldowns than LeBlanc, so it's a pretty difficult matchup for LeBlanc overall. So in the early game, we're getting a slight we're going for a slight push. I believe in this lane, I'm going for a 2-wave crash instead of a 3-wave. The reason for that is they have LeBlanc Lee Sin, so I have to be kind of scared about getting ganked. So I'm just going to be looking to kind of harass LeBlanc whenever she goes for a CS. Here, level 2 advantage versus level 1, I can get a nice heavy trade onto her. It kind of looks dumb like what she did there, like maybe she could have W'd away, but she can't ever W into me because it just means that I out-trade her with even more auto attacks. So at the moment, yeah, we're just kind of like building up our lead, and we're not doing anything too special at the moment. We've crashed 2 waves, and we're going to go ward. I'm placing the ward on top side. I believe Lee did start top side. I actually can't remember. So it could be a kind of mistake of the ward, but we're going to talk about wards in a future video. That's not a big deal. Now the wave's going to start pushing back to me. We're going to still keep looking to harass LeBlanc when she goes for CS, but if possible, we do kind of want to let this wave come to us. And the reason for that is, again, like, even though Lucian wins like extended and burst trades against LeBlanc, the one like way LeBlanc does have to win this matchup is through the gank setup. And because we have Kayn, which is like an AFK farming jungler, and they have like LeBlanc Lee Sin, that's like a very, very scary ganking combo and very strong early game. So we need to be very, very careful of these kind of like early ganks. So far, trades are going very well for us. She's lost quite a bit of HP. I think can't remember actually in the game, but I think the way she was positioning here was a bit suspect. She was positioning a little bit aggressive, so I thought there's like a pretty high chance that someone's here. Turns out it's Karma, which doesn't really matter. Can just run away from her here. That is a little bit annoying. I do lose a little bit of HP for that, but it doesn't really matter. And with the wave pushing to me kind of in this spot, it's gonna be quite good. I'm gonna be safe from ganks like as soon as this gets a little bit closer, and if we can just kind of make sure not to die and build a lead at the same time, it's like really, really good, especially when we have a Kayn. So here there's like a Lee Sin gank and a Karma as well. I actually forgot about that. That could only really work if LeBlanc committed her flash, and then I would match flash as well. Yeah, so something she could have done. But now that we know Lee Sin is topside, we're in a much better place to kind of start playing this a bit more aggressively. So LeBlanc's getting very, very low. I actually can't remember if she has TP or Ignite. I think she has TP from what I remember. But anyway, after getting her low... Oh no, she has Ignite. After getting her low, we're going to push this in and look to base. So we've pushed in base. At the moment, it's 36 CS to 20, which means on this base, we are going to be a little bit ahead in gold. And that's really important because we've denied like a wave of XP. So we're going to be up XP as well as up gold. Which is going to allow us to take very, very advantageous trades. Not only do we have the edge in matchup, but we also now have the edge in items and XP, which makes it very, very difficult for LeBlanc to play the game. So after crashing that wave, the wave is going to bounce back to us now, which means that especially because LeBlanc has such poor wave clear, it's going to be very easy for us to keep this frozen. And that's so good because she's not going to be able to farm, as well as it's going to make us safe from all the ganks. So yeah, it's just like pretty much good all around. The only time this would be bad really is if LeBlanc could get some roams off, but it's pretty unlikely here. Or also if Kayn wanted to invade, but Kayn's on his Krug, so he doesn't really want to invade. So at the moment, we're just going to try keep the wave here as long as possible. If LeBlanc ever uses a cooldown here to try thin the wave, we can look to trade really aggressively on her because we're so strong. So LeBlanc basically has nothing to do here. Obviously she shouldn't be taking damage, but there is kind of no way for her to get this farm without spam pinging her jungler to come fix the wave, which is what needs to happen. Sucks for her, but that's what happens when you verse a Giga Chad alpha mid laner like myself. So I think she W's forward for this creep. Okay, so now we know that LeBlanc's on this like 18, or I guess it's like 14 by now. She got 3 points in it. Second cooldown. So if she ever walked up here, I would actually E into her and she would like get very close to dying. So I believe she takes the base here. But we can just like keep this wave here for now. We'll probably end up pushing it in a bit, but we can deny a few more creeps before this starts pushing back to her. I think now in a minute I'm going to start looking to hard push it in. Maybe let a few more die. I'm actually not sure what I was thinking here. I probably should have pushed quicker. I think maybe I wasn't sure if LeBlanc was roaming or basing, so I didn't push it immediately. But I think I probably should have fast pushed that. Although another thing that I could be thinking here was that I was building a wave to crash into her, but I don't think that's what I was doing. I think I was just didn't realize she based. But now that she has based, we're going to start looking to keep trading on her. We can keep this slow pushing in because it gives us more opportunities to kind of harass her on the way in. There's, again, still not many ways for her to trade onto us. And because we saw Lee Sin bot there, I believe, we don't really have to be scared of getting ganked either. Right now we're level 7 to level 5, and we have a lot of priority. We're also 60 CS to 25, so we're very, very far ahead. And we can look to use our priority now to help Kayn invade. So you can see this is like one of those situations where now I can actually like use my priority for something. I don't need to freeze. Here we can just always win 2v2s because it's level 7 versus level 5. Not to mention, actually there's probably not a huge item difference now because she based and I didn't. But overall, there's still like a huge power difference in mid lane, which makes it very difficult for them to kind of take any like fights or anything around mid lane. They've kind of missed their window a bit. So here we're going to try crash this into her tower. You can see again we zoned her off more CS there. She kind of positioned in a way that she would have to kind of like walk around, and we're still just like making sure we deny as much CS as possible while the wave's still pushing in. She hasn't really been able to farm like any CS, and of course we're still looking to harass her every time she goes for CS. But I believe the CS lead is around 40 now. That's starting to get pretty big. And as you guys kind of know, like once we build a item and XP advantage, the advantage just increases kind of like more and more. So at this point, it's like sort of over for LeBlanc. There isn't really a way back in the game for her. The reason I fast push this instead of freezing it is actually because she's like pretty low already. So if she plays too greedy, I can actually just dive her under her tower. Here I could have gone for it, but unfortunately Lee Sin walked me off. But this is still like a good use of kind of our time. We're making the enemy jungler come mid, and it's not like LeBlanc really gets anything out of it. Like, she gets to farm a few more CS, but unless we actually die to a gank, it doesn't meaningfully change the game. I try to cancel LeBlanc's base here. I don't know if I get it. I think I did get it actually. And now I crash this again. LeBlanc is too low to actually stay here, I'm pretty sure. Typed a CSD check in chat because I wanted people to see that I was up like, I don't know, like 83 CS to 37. Yeah, that's pretty crazy. Yeah, so we crashed another wave, and then we're just looking for the base. Don't really think there is anything else to this. At this point, the item advantage is just so big, and we can keep the wave frozen here again. I'm not pushing here because she's not low and Kane's not currently looking to invade, so we can look to freeze it again. And also, LeBlanc can't really roam anywhere. Like, if we look at the map, there's a Tahm Kench top, so pretty much ungankable. And also, both our bot lane is on full HP and kind of close to their tower. So there isn't really anywhere LeBlanc can roam, so that kind of just like makes overall the best decision here is just to kind of like freeze that wave. Now Kane is doing Dragon, which is why I decided to push, because if there is a contest on this, I want to be able to move to it. And we see Lee Sin top now, so it's also much safer to push again. And I think that is going to be pretty much it for this lane. We'll just watch the rest of this wave, but I do believe that at the end of this wave... Oh, there's actually a Karma here. Did I kill this guy? Oh, I kind of wasted my ult on him. Either way, it doesn't really matter. So I think at the end of this wave, we're 100 CS to 43. And this is against a Master Tier LeBlanc player, so it's not like I'm just like bullying silver players or something. This is something that I can do somewhat reliably in high elo if I get the right matchup. So to kind of summarize range versus range in general, it's a lot about cooldowns, a lot about punishing people when they go for CS, and then there's a lot you can do with the wave control to affect the matchup. Again, I've done so many range versus range already in my various champion guides, as well as in my lane-like videos, so I recommend checking those out if you want more kind of like tips on the range versus range side of things. I think range versus range as well is also the most common matchup in mid lane, especially at the moment. It's a very mage heavy meta, so that'll probably help you the most if you have if you kind of watch all those other videos as well. So for our next example, we have the melee versus range matchups. Typically in these matchups, you have the advantage in extended trades, but you generally get poked down quite a bit. So in melee versus range matchups, and again we've talked about this in the lane like Doinby as the Kali videos, check that out as well. But generally in these matchups, you kind of like want to keep the wave on your side in the early game, and you kind of like want more space to run your opponent down. Those extended trades are very, very nice for you generally, and also all-ins, depending on like which champ you're playing, can be good as well. So in the early game, we're mainly going to be looking to just like let these early waves come to us, and we're going to be trying to avoid as much damage as possible. The one nice thing is that melee champions do have very nice access to like runes and items. The champions like, items like Doran's Shield and runes like the Resolve setup, like Second Wind, can be very, very useful for helping you survive against some of these like ranged champions. This was a VOD from last year, so don't take Fleet Footwork on Yone anymore. But it used to be the meta. So yeah, you can just see here, we're not doing that much. We're just looking to try and like get CS and avoid taking damage if we can. We're avoiding a lot of Syndra's harass. And as you can see here, mana bar is starting to go down, but our health hasn't really moved. So that's kind of a really, really good situation to be in. Really important, especially against ranged champions as a melee champion, that you don't push in the first few levels. And that's generally because if you push against ranged champions in the early levels, typically you will just get frozen on and it'll be really hard for you to do anything. But you can see like that extended trades go very, very nicely in your favor. And so if you have like more room to like run down the lane, it's like really, really good for you to look for those extended trades. And that's like another reason why you really want the wave kind of on your side. So here I can't remember if I actually killed this wave or not. I think it was too many. Oh no, I actually held this wave, I guess. I held some of it. It was too many creeps to tank the whole thing, but I did manage to stop his base and keep the wave like sort of on my side. So I'd say still this is a pretty big win. And you can see like at this point in the lane, this is like so nice for me. It's only level 4 and I'm already able to zone him off CS because I'm basically full health and he has like almost no mana. So at this point in the lane, I'm like insanely far ahead. I'm actually already 27 CS to 18. And that's like crazy for kind of like a melee versus range matchup. So now I can like position really aggressively. I can look to actually zone him off CS, which is definitely not how it should be going. And he also has to be quite careful of gank setup as well. Like Yone is pretty good gank setup, although Syndra does too. But I can kind of like look for plays onto him, kind of like this. I believe he does have to flash here. Yep, okay, so flashed over the wall. So this is like your dream scenario for a melee champion, is like you've gotten through those like early levels without taking too much damage. Generally, if you're like a little bit behind in CS as a melee champion, you're actually ahead in the early game. So if you can actually be ahead in CS like this, you're actually like massively far ahead in compared to how you should be. So and another thing is that especially when you're playing these like extended trade like champions that like run your opponent down the lane, if they ever have to use flash, it's such a big deal because like they won't be able to disengage from like you just like forcing an all in with flash. So I think melee versus ranged, it's a bit simpler honestly, I think, than range versus ranged. I think a lot of it does depend on like your wave control and how well you dodge skill shots in that, and obviously it does depend a lot on the matchup as well. Here I could have frozen the wave, but I knew he was going to TP back, so I wanted to kind of like force these waves under his tower and just make it so it was like sort of difficult for him to CS. But I think in hindsight it was probably a mistake, just because I did have to be a little careful of his jungler, and he was able to get most of the CS under tower, although he did miss some. So I don't know, it maybe could have been a little bit better if I froze it, but I don't think it was a huge deal overall. And you can see now he is forced to base and the CS is 44, but I think it was about 30, and I get this wave as well. So yeah, I think this is honestly like pretty much all there is to the kind of like melee versus range matchups. I think, you know, similar to other matchups, obviously you look for the all-ins when you can and stuff like that, but if you can just like manage especially like the first few levels without taking too much damage and kind of like looking to attack their mana bar, that can be really good as well. I guess like the last thing is that once you do have an item advantage, I actually wasn't sure what to buy here, I remember that. It was like when Yone was sort of new. When you do have the item advantage, again, you're like really good at all-ins. So if you can pull the wave kind of on your side, so here, I know Syndra doesn't have flash, and I know I can all-in her super easily. So I'm making a really big effort to kind of keep this wave frozen on my side, because I know it makes it super hard for her to play the game, if I can keep it here. And this is like the case for most melee versus range matchups, and you'll see that every time I do this, Nocturne is forced to kind of come and break the wave, and I kind of like move back aggressively on her, and Nocturne again is like forced to come. So you can just like waste a huge amount of the enemy jungler's time like that, and you can see again, Syndra's almost you know, and this is just like your dream as a melee, is basically you have the wave like here, you're kind of forcing the enemy jungler to come, you have like all this room to all in, and if the jungler doesn't come, you can just take the kill. Yeah, so I think to kind of summarize the kind of like melee versus range matchups, again, like punishing cooldowns and looking for all-ins is like really good, the same as any matchup, but the kind of things that are very specific to the melee versus range matchup is how important wave control is and avoiding damage, especially in the early game. Just almost pretty much every matchup I can think of is a melee versus ranged. You want them wave on your side. I guess the only exception to this is melee champions that have high amounts of wave clears, so champs like Talon or Galio or something like that, they can push the wave and look to roam. But for the most part, as these like melee versus range, the wave control is actually the most important thing. You really want the wave on your side, just to give you way more options, make you way safer, and make the enemy gankable. So now we're going to talk about range versus melee, and this is the one that I think people have the most trouble with and I get the most questions about. So we're actually probably going to go over like maybe a couple examples, or maybe like you know, 1.5 examples or something like that for this one. But generally, as range versus melee in the early game, you are much stronger typically. They kind of suffer from your ranged auto attacks, and also most of the melee champions are either weak until level 3 or weak until level 6. So again, it does depend on the champion. Like there are exceptions, like Aurelia, for example, very strong at level 2 onwards. Honestly, just a really annoying champ to verse. But for a champ like Yone, Akali, they kind of spike at level 6. And for champs like Fizz, they kind of like spike at level 3 and then again at level 6. So in these sort of ranged versus melee matchups, we can look to like be very aggressive early game and try and build a big enough the lead that once they do kind of like hit that spike or they hit the point where they can start being really aggressive in the matchup, they already have a big enough lead that they can't really do anything about it. The ranged champions, when they can get all in, do want the wave on their side so that they can't get all in. So they're safe from the gank setup, and so just generally they can like farm it out and they're not really under any threat. So here we can mainly see I'm just harassing Yone whenever he goes for CS. And I know that just in general, I win trades against Yone in the early game just because of, again, champion difference. Like in the early game or in the pre-6 especially, Vex is stronger than Yone, and it doesn't really matter how he trades, he's still going to lose like pretty much either way. So in this sort of like range versus melee matchup, yeah, we're just going to keep looking to harass him early, and eventually we'll have a big enough lead in kind of like gold and XP that there isn't really going to be like much he can do anymore. So just continually pushing this in. The only thing I would really need to be careful of is the enemy jungler. Yone does have like pretty good gank setup, but we only really have to care about it when he has his Q3 ready, and also Lilia isn't the greatest ganker, so we don't have to be insanely scared, but in other melee or other range versus melee matchups, you might need to care a little bit more. I'm not so sure what the CS advantage is at the moment. I think it's pretty significant, probably. Yeah, so it's like 24 to 15 at the moment, and we both have Ignite, so it's like sort of hard for anyone to get just like a TP reset, but we're just continually like making sure that whenever he goes CS that he gets at least contested for, or he gets like sort of punished for it, making it difficult for him just to like scale for free. We really want it to be that when he hits level 6, that he is like far enough behind that he can't just like all in us. You'll find that if you do fall behind to a melee champion, like if they hit level 6 and you guys are like even, or you're even behind, that it'll be very, very difficult for you to play out the kind of like early mid game. Once you get to late game, I think ranged champions typically do have the advantage again, but typically in the mid game, melee champions are much, much stronger, and that can be very, very difficult to deal with. So here, this is like pretty sad, honestly. Like despite me missing Q, I still hard win the trade. There's just like, yeah, we're just like basically looking to bully him a lot earlier. There's like not really much to say here. I do bring my jungler over, and we're able to kind of like push him off this wave at his tower. I think we do kill him here, but even if we didn't kill him, I think this would still be in a like extremely good spot to be in. I'm not sure what the CS is at the moment, but I think it's pretty crazy. Let's see, when I press tab, it must be like 45 to 25 or something, I'm guessing. Let's see, I'm not sure if I ever press it, but okay, 46 to 23 on the first base, so that's like very, very nice. Now we have a huge item advantage. So at this point in the lane, we do have a couple options. If you feel strong enough to just spam push the wave and look for roams, you can do that, but otherwise just keeping the wave in the middle or keeping the wave on your side can be safer. We know he's not quite level 6 yet, so we don't really need to be scared, and also he just used his cooldown, so we can play quite aggressive. But I think at this moment, I do just want to push the wave because I'm not really scared of him, although this might change in the future when he hits level 6, and also when Lilia hits level 6, because Lilia's another champion that doesn't really gank in the early game, but can gank kind of later on. Okay, so here actually, here's an example. So I walked bot, but then after coming back mid, he was level 6 and I don't have flash, so it's a window where I have to be very, very careful, especially when my jungler's on dragon. So at this point in the lane, I recognize it's a window where there's like a high probability that I die, and so even though I'm feel safe enough to push once my jungler's like back on the map, for this kind of small window I need to be very, very careful. So basically, just anytime you feel scared, or anytime you don't want to be like pushed up, or you can't be pushed up, you can use those times, or rather in those times, you can just like keep the wave on your side. You can see it's very, very difficult for Yone to trade with me at the moment. The wave's just like too far up for him to really do anything, and I'm not really gankable either. So I'd say that's kind of like the main stuff, I think, for rangers melee. It's mainly about punishing in the early game, and then after level 6, kind of like looking to freeze the wave. I'll quickly go over another example for you guys just to make it like a little bit clearer in case it wasn't already. So in this matchup here, we're playing Corki versus Aurelia, which is like, it's pretty much as bad as the matchups get. So when you're in a matchup like this, where you can be all in to basically any time, or just if you are at the point where those melee champions are spiking, you really want to try to keep the wave at least in the middle or on your side, preferably. I think I blew up that wave because I was scared of Aurelia roaming bot, but it might have been better to freeze that anyway. But just in general, like, like this especially is a matchup where I just like cannot trade back at all. I have no threat onto Aurelia and she has extremely high threat onto me. But you'll see that like if I keep the wave where I am now, I'm actually pretty safe from her all in, unless I get a bit lower and she can tower dive me. But from kind of where it is now, she is somewhat under threat because she does have to play a little careful of getting ganked. But also she doesn't really have the kind of space in the lane to actually all in me. So I see people ask, like, how do you play against champs like Zed, Akali, etc. when you hit level 6, where they just all in you, and a huge part of that is the wave control. If you can keep it on your side, it makes it just like 10 times harder for you to all in. And one thing you'll need to be careful of is that eventually the wave is going to push out like this. So when that happens, you either need help to kind of fix it, or you need to try like fix it on your own. Or you just need to kind of like play safe on the window. It is okay to just like try farm from range and be like very careful to avoid their all in. So let's go to one final example. So here's an example that I showed a little bit before of the Cass versus Yone matchup. So this is a matchup where now I have a really big advantage in the matchup, and I'm just gonna like try and keep the wave here again. And so like while freezing in these like these range versus melee matchups is useful for keeping yourself safe, it's also really useful for denying them CS. So most melee champions have a very, very hard time CSing from range, and that's not something that most range champs have difficulty with. It's mainly like a melee champion problem. So in these kind of like range versus melee matchups, you can often deny them a huge amount of CS by keeping the wave frozen. So it's basically just like another reason on top of all the others to kind of like keep the wave frozen on your side. Again, it helps you avoid getting ganked, helps you deny CS, avoid all-ins. There's a ton of reasons to do it, and I just reiterate in case I like haven't mentioned it before. The freezing isn't always good, and especially against champs like Talon, you have to be quite careful about freezing because they can very easily roam to other lanes. And in those sort of lanes, you would instead want to just like keep the wave in the middle, or at least like make sure you have some wards down so that if you are freezing, you can push the wave when Talon leaves or something like that. The last type of matchup that we have is the melee versus melee matchup, and I think this is the one that kind of depends the most on the matchup you're playing. But we'll kind of go over like what the core fundamentals of the matchup are anyway. So generally, one thing that's really important in these melee versus melee matchup is who wins the extended trades. Obviously, that's important in every matchup, but particularly in melee versus melee matchups. Also, punishing cooldowns is very, very important because a lot of the melee champions have much longer cooldowns than ranged champions. And the last thing that I think is really, really important is actually the minions. So because like you're going to be trading so many orders, the minions are actually really, really important in this matchup. So whoever has more minions will often win the trade pretty much no matter what. I actually don't remember that game getting paused, so we're going to skip ahead a little bit. Okay, so we're back in the game. I went and warded those, but it doesn't really matter. So yeah, basically in this matchup, Nocturne wins extended trades, which makes him kind of like a pretty good counter to Lee Sin. And also Nocturne is very good at like clearing out the minion wave, which means he'll typically have a minion wave advantage, which makes him very, very good against Lee Sin. And also, as we said before, there are kind of those like very melee versus melee specific things. Like as I said, it's very much about matchup. So in this matchup, for example, like the Nocturne can spell shield, like really key skills from Lee. You can either spell shield the Q or you can spell shield the R, and both of those are really, really good. Another reason is that like Lee Sin obviously has the execute, but Nocturne has a lot of sustain. So there's just like a lot of reasons that are like not just fundamental that kind of Nocturne wins this matchup. You can see I'm pushing a lot. The reason for that is I'm not really scared of getting ganked. Lee Sin doesn't really have any gank setup, and also as we said before, the kind of the minions play such a big role in these melee versus melee matchups. So if you can push, you probably should, unless you're far enough ahead that you can just freeze and fight them anyway. Like you often see this in top lane. If one of the top laners gets far enough ahead of the other, they'll freeze it and it basically just won't ever get broken because they're just like too strong to kind of break it 2v1, and oftentimes the jungler can't come top and fix your wave for you. Here, I'm letting the wave come to me. That's because my jungler is very far away from my lane and I have no wards on either side. So I'm quite scared at this moment. I can just like kind of farm the wave, chill out a bit. Don't really have to be aggressive at this moment. But now that I see like Rumble is a bit closer, I can start looking to be aggressive again, start thinning out this wave, and start looking to take trades back on Lee Sin. So Lee goes in. I know I win extended trades, so if he does that, I'm just going to chop him up. Rumble forces his flash. Obviously, the trade was going quite well for me anyway, but it's really nice that Rumble goes flash as well on top of that. Now with Lee Sin no flash, it does mean that basically if he ever trades onto me, like if he ever like goes for a full committal trade and we're both like high HP, there's like a reasonable chance that I can just flash forward and kill him. Fortunately here I do have to basic, mainly because I run out of mana, and also I run out of creeps to sustain off of. But as I get back to this lane here, it's going to start going really, really well for me. I know he doesn't have the flash. I know I win extended trades, and I think I also have an item advantage. I actually can't remember what he bought. We might have to see. But overall, I'm just like in a really, really good spot at the moment, and I can kind of like use this strength to impact everything. Okay, so he actually hasn't based yet. I'm gonna go use some priority, get a ward down here, and then I'll keep looking to kind of harass him when he comes back to lane. I think he TP's back. Let's just skip ahead a little bit. Yeah, okay, so he TP'd back to lane. Now that we're both like full HP, we have actually equal items, and I'd say about equal XP. So the only like real advantage here we have is the like champion advantage. I might even be down in XP because my jungler was here. I'm actually not sure about that. But we still know that we win these extended trades, which is so important in these melee versus melee matchups, which means like if we fight him, probably even level 5 to level 4, I mean level 5 to level 6, we will just win trades. Like you saw there, right? The trade went so far in my favor, even though I was actually like down in XP. And that's why I kind of like, I don't know, it's not that I don't like melee versus melee matchups, but a lot of them do feel more matchup dependent than the others. I feel like most range versus range matchups are winnable, like no matter what, but I feel like melee versus melee matchups are a lot more about like stat checks and just like champion checks. Obviously it's not the like always the case, and there's still tons of skill expression, right? But I do feel like it's a bit simpler to play maybe, and a bit more like what's it called? Maybe a bit more like set in stone, like who wins the matchup. But obviously it's not always the case, and it depends a lot on what champions you're playing, because I think this is a matchup that's Nocturne favored. But if you play two melees that are like kind of like closer in strength, or one doesn't counter the other, then there will be just as much skill expression as the others, because there won't be that just like you don't just stat check them, or you don't just do that. So here, I don't know why he queued into me. I win extended trades even without Nocturne here. I mean, without Rumble there, I would have probably killed him. I can always flash after him. And also I managed to get the spell shield on the kick. So I think that's kind of just like the main things for these melee versus melee matchups is identifying who wins that extended trades. Again, like any item kind of like breakpoints or things like that. Like there might be, you know, once someone reaches like serrated Dirk, they become too strong to fight. Or once someone reaches like certain boots, they're like too hard to run away from, or something like that. And also, yeah, so like pushing, like using those minions to your advantage, who wins extended trades. I think those are the most important things for melee versus melee matchups. Also quickly say that I feel like melee versus melee matchups, they have, like I was saying before, they are the most like specific matchup to matchup. Like it's really important you know the matchups and not just the fundamentals in these, but also they have the most special interactions compared to other matchups. So you know, there's not that many range matchups that have kind of special interactions, you know, stuff like the Syndra E canceling the LeBlanc W, but I feel like there's a lot of melee versus melee matchups where there's stuff you can kind of like do to the other person that makes it like that like drastically impact the trade. So I guess I'm kind of rambling on at this point. I think the most important thing is just that you really know these melee versus melee matchups. If you play a melee champion, to really know them. And I think in general, like you don't see melee versus melee that often in mid, because I think most of the time that melee champions are picked as counters to range champions rather than just picking a melee versus melee, but I figured I'd cover it anyway. But I do think it's more of a top lane thing overall. So guys, I think that is it for this video. It took me a long time to make, and I'm really sorry it was so late. It was really difficult actually to kind of like try and put everything that I think about into like actual concepts, I feel like, that I could teach, because a lot of the times I would just like be using terms I kind of like made up in my head, and like things that made sense to me but might not make sense to other people. But hopefully guys, you learned something from it. Again, if you haven't checked out all my other laning stuff, like the lane like videos, the laning sections of each of my champion guides, I feel like that's a lot of like extra information that could be quite useful as well. Obviously there will be some stuff that's repeated, but I've also probably said things in there that I forgot to put in here as well. Guys, don't expect to learn this all in one go. As you can tell, like I really love laning, and I spent so long becoming really good at laning. So I think like it's not something you should expect to just learn overnight. It's going to take a lot of practice, but if you focus on one thing at a time, you know, focus on say just like punishing cooldowns to begin with, and then when you're good at that, you focus on the next thing, eventually you'll be really good at laning as well. But but it does take time. Again, just like, don't get frustrated if you don't get good immediately. There's so much to learn out there, and I find it really, really fun. But overall, guys, if you like, go ahead and like and subscribe. Really would mean a lot to me, and it took me a long time to make this video. But thank you guys. Thanks for the support as always. I'll see you next time.